Welcome, everyone, to the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. I am your co-host, Licensed Battlefield Guide Eric Lindblade, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, Licensed Battlefield Guide Jim Hessler. And Jim, tell everyone what our topic tonight is.
Yeah, Eric, we are back for part 2 of Culp's Hill, July 2nd. Now, where we left off in part 1, it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on July 2nd. Longstreet's main attack was starting to begin against the Union left, over opposite the Union right. Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps, specifically Edward Allegheny Johnson's division, was getting ready to go into action, and you still had the majority of the Union Army 12th Corps on Culp's Hill, ready to face them. So we're going to pick up with the combat on July 2nd at Culp's Hill here on the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. So before we do that, Eric, what kind of housekeeping do we have for today?
Really, the biggest thing, once again, we want to remind you where you can find us on social media. You can find us on Facebook at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast, on Twitter at Gettysburg Pod, on Instagram at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast, and also you can reach us by email at gettysburgpodcast@gmail.com. All right, as you can tell, we're fired up, we're well fed, we're ready to go. So let's get right to the episode here. As Jim said, it's 4 o'clock, July 2nd, 1863. Let's pick up the story.
Yeah, now as we left off last time, Ewell had been ordered to basically make a diversion in support of Longstreet's attack to be converted into a real attack if an opportunity offered. Ewell made the necessary preparations, and as Ewell reported at about 5 p.m., I don't know, maybe we can quibble the time a little bit, when General Longstreet's guns opened, General Johnson then commenced a heavy cannonade from Andrews' battalion and Graham's battery under Major Latimer against Cemetery Hill. So this is Ewell kind of opening up with some artillery here to create this diversion opposite the Union right. Eric, I know we talked about we're not going to go into a deep dive on the Benner's Hill artillery action, but you want to kind of give the folks an overview of what's going on?
When we look at Benner's Hill, I think it actually warrants its own episode.
Oh, hell yeah.
I think it's a fascinating part of the battle. But what we're going to see is Major Joseph Latimer's artillery, suffice to say, is going to suffer heavy losses in this furious artillery duel with Union artillery on Cemetery Hill and elements of Culp's Hill as well. After about a half hour, the Confederate artillery is driven off Benner's Hill, including Major Latimer, who's going to be mortally wounded. Now, for our story on Culp's Hill, the bombardment's going to have very little impact on Union troops there. Although one interesting account I found from General Geary is going to indicate that the artillery had a disconcerting impact on the infantry. Because imagine you're part of Geary's troops up there on Culp's Hill. When you hear this heavy bombardment, your veteran troops, what does a heavy bombardment mean? It means there's probably going to be an attack coming against your front pretty soon. So everybody's kind of on edge here. As this is going on, of course, the Confederate infantry is sitting kind of idly throughout this, waiting to go into the fight. So now this artillery duel has been going on for a while. It's starting to peter out a bit. Edward Johnson's division, minus Walker's brigade, the Stonewall Brigade, is going to begin to move. But before we get into the Confederate movements here, what's happening along the Union line on Culp's Hill at this moment? Because we're going to see a lot of movement at this point.
Yeah, and again, times vary. Some accounts put it a little bit after 6 o'clock. Some put it as close to 7 o'clock. But I think sometime around 6 o'clock-ish, General Meade makes what, quite frankly, you could argue is his biggest mistake during the Battle of Gettysburg. And yeah, it's easy to see that in hindsight, and we're not Monday morning quarterbacking. But General Meade, in order to alleviate some of this pressure against his left and what he thinks is the relative inactivity on the Culp's Hill front, Meade basically orders Slocum to move the 12th Corps off of Culp's Hill to reinforce the Union left. So it starts with General Williams. Williams is going to march his division out of the Culp's Hill vicinity and McAllister's Hill area, and he's going to march them down the Granite Schoolhouse Road toward the Union left. Now, Williams later wrote that he received an order from Slocum to send a division to reinforce the left, which was, quote, being hard-pressed. Lockwood and the 1st Division were nearest in line of march. So off they went. Williams told Slocum he feared the rebels would seize the line if they left, so they ordered Geary to cover the whole line. Slocum sends an aide to Meade with the recommendation that Geary stay, but around 7 o'clock-ish, an aide returned from Meade with orders to also move Geary away. They agree, though, we're going to leave one brigade behind. That's going to turn out to be George Sears Greene on the top of the hill. So as we said in part one, what started out as sort of an 8,600-man Union defense has been rapidly stripped down to about 1,300 men or so from George Greene's brigade. And now they're basically going to have to cover the whole eastern slope of the hill from the top all the way downhill through that saddle and even over to the summit of the lower hill.
Now, I believe we had a listener question talking about, lack of a better term, the misadventures of John Geary's men as they make this movement. And Jim, I think you got a little more on that to shed some light on it.
Yeah, just a little bit. I mean, to answer the listener question. So what happened is they decide they're going to keep a brigade behind. It's going to be Greene's brigade. So Kane and Candy's brigades basically move off Culp's Hill with General Geary leading them. However, Geary doesn't have a guide. So Geary leads the two brigades down the Baltimore Pike where they miss the Granite Schoolhouse Road intersection, and Geary's guys are going to march all the way about to Rock Creek, where I think at that time they kind of realize, hey, we missed something. They're going to stop in some confusion. They're going to bivouac for a little while and await further orders. So, I mean, the simplest answer is Geary didn't have a guide and he missed Granite Schoolhouse Road.
And folks, one of the important things of studying history is drawing lessons that can improve your life. Notice what caused problems for John Geary. He didn't have a guide. Folks, if this is not proof on why you need a licensed battlefield guide when you come to visit this battlefield, I don't know what else to tell you.
Yeah, I don't know. It's the only way to see Gettysburg, with a guide.
Not only is it the only way, it is the best way.
Just ask John Geary for an endorsement.
Wait, is he our next sponsor? And we kind of covered a humorous part of this. I mean, nobody really gets hurt because they take the wrong turn. I think it does show the confusion on a battlefield. It happens. Sometimes people take the wrong road. But I want to go back to a point that people have often made about this moment in the fight. When Meade orders the bulk of the 12th Corps off of Culp's Hill, people often say it's Meade's biggest mistake. It's a blunder. I don't know if I really deem it a blunder. I mean, I think if you look at the position Meade was in at this time, he's seen Sickles' front collapsing. Mm-hmm. He's seen heavy pressure against his center. Not only is he seeing the Confederate brigades moving towards Cemetery Ridge, I'm sure he's able to get a sense of what's still to the north of that, seemingly more troops pouring down. What option does he have?
Well, and so I want to clarify. So notice that I emphasized it's a mistake in hindsight because I don't really feel like getting a whole bunch of, Jim, you're playing quarterback on poor General Meade. General Meade is the unsung hero. I don't need all those emails. Is it a mistake in hindsight? Yeah, it is, because the guys that get pulled off of Culp's Hill are not needed to reinforce against Longstreet's attack on the left, and as subsequent results will show, it almost, quote-unquote, almost caused the Union Army to lose the right on Culp's Hill. So, again, I'm not aspiring or putting quote-unquote, notice how I'm making a lot of air quotes right now because I'm trying to be careful. I'm not putting quote-unquote blame on General Meade. General Meade did not have Phil Liano's wonderful Gettysburg Campaign Atlas that has maps with all of the troop positions. And again, I think it's a reminder that, as a Civil War general at ground level, you really have a very limited ability to understand what the enemy is doing. Now, we can say, well, he pulled them away because there was no Confederate activity, and that's more or less true from an infantry perspective, but by that time, you had the heavy artillery bombardment coming from the Benner's Hill area. So you might have, with a little bit of prescience and forethought, might have said, hey, maybe this artillery action is going to lead to something. I'm not blaming Meade, but I am sort of defending that position, which frankly a lot of historians have made.
And I'll just say, I think it shows two things in Meade's thinking at this point. Mm-hmm. One, it shows how much he felt his center was threatened. And I think at this point, Meade has been in the saddle for a couple hours now. He's putting out fire after fire after fire. And I wonder how much he really thinks, hey, I'm endangering my right flank. I think right now he says, my center's endangered. I'm going to figure that out, and then we'll figure out the right flank later. That's just the mindset he has at this moment.
Well, and that's again goes back to the original overriding question, why his history focused on the Union left and not so much the Union right. And I'll say what I said again in part one. Not all of that, but part of that comes from the men on the ground were more focused on the Union left. You see it in Meade's actions. You see it in Lee's actions. You see it in their after-action reports. You see it in their testimony before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. The action on the left, folks, is important. So, we can say, well, Culp's Hill is quote-unquote more important, but you don't really see that being reflected in a lot of the contemporary actions of the leaders on the battlefield. And Eric, here at Gettysburg, I'm going to get off my soapbox for a minute.
As I watch Jim get off the soapbox right now, I think what we see is Meade is being very reactionary here. I think it also shows that does he feel his defenses in that sector of the field, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, are adequate enough to allow this? I mean, if he didn't feel that they were adequate, I don't think he would have pulled the number of troops he did.
Well, remember, though, the original instruction is the entire 12th Corps.
Right.
Right? It's a, hey, can we leave a brigade behind? So initially the idea is, man, we're just getting rid of everybody because nothing's going on over there. I mean, I know the Iron Brigade is mighty, but if you only left the Iron Brigade behind, could they really hold off Johnson's entire division?
And this isn't the Iron Brigade of July 1st, folks.
Right.
They're cut to pieces.
Should we now flip the tables a little bit? Because I know there was another listener question that said, well, okay, if Ewell was only making a diversion to convert into a real attack, what did Ewell see at this moment to turn it into attack? Should we go there next?
Absolutely. I think let's now go back to the Confederate Second Corps.
And I think both Eric and I were very supportive of Ewell in general in Season 1, Episode 3, What If Jackson Were at Gettysburg? But, I think you do have to kind of wonder, diversion, if the opportunity offers, converted into a real attack. What does Ewell think he sees as his opportunity at this moment? Certainly his positions for his own artillery support are very limited. And as Eric talked about with the Confederate batteries being knocked off of Benner's Hill, any and all artillery support on this part of the field for Ewell has basically been removed. So he doesn't have artillery. The strength of the Federal position is unknown, although, they might have seen some of the Federal skirmishers being withdrawn. I do not believe they see that full-scale movement off of the lower end of Culp's Hill to kind of influence the movement. And remember, as I think we touched on, Johnson's manpower is now reduced by the detachment of Walker's brigade. So you've got an unknown enemy position in front of you. You've got no artillery support, and you've just cut your manpower by about 25%. I'm not sure what Ewell sees as the opportunity, and we may never know.
And not only that, a formidable Union position. I mean, we have the accounts from Ewell's Corps of hearing the work going on up there. They know that there is somebody up there, and they're probably well positioned up there. So as we now have Edward Johnson's men moving, well, what does Allegheny have to say about this?
Yeah, what does Johnson say? So in his report, he says, quote, in obedience to an order from the Lieutenant General commanding, I advanced my infantry to the assault of the enemy's strong position, a rugged and rocky mountain, heavily timbered and difficult of ascent, a natural fortification rendered more formidable by deep entrenchments, end quote. Now, Eric is going to talk to you guys kind of about how the brigades move out. The only thing I wanted to point out from Johnson's report was notice that he received the order from General Ewell, and I point that out just in case anybody was thinking, hey, maybe Johnson's kind of doing this on his own hook. I mean, he says he gets the order from Ewell. And then again, notice in Johnson's report, he does talk about the difficulty and the rugged nature of the ground. Probably some of that is hindsight when he wrote the report afterwards, but I think there's no doubt that the advancing Confederates are going to realize, hey man, we got a tough assignment here. And again, we don't even know what the enemy's strength is in front of us. Eric, with that as the background, you want to talk about how Johnson's brigades move into action?
Sure. What we're going to see is Brigadier General John Jones's Virginians on Johnson's right begin to move in first, followed by Colonel Jesse Williams' Louisianans, and they're going to advance to about Rock Creek. Now, the 3rd Brigade, under Brigadier General George Stewart on Johnson's left, is going to be delayed for a couple reasons. One is the terrain of the area. A lot of things to have to contend with, including Rock Creek itself. But he's also going to be delayed by the movement of Jesse Williams's troops in his front. So because of these delays, the Confederates are not really to make this assault until about 7 o'clock at the earliest. And even then, there's some evidence that not all of Stewart's brigade was actually up when the initial fighting begins. So we're already seeing delays. And not only that, by 7 o'clock, what's it starting to do on the battlefield? It's starting to get dark. We're seeing all these things that Johnson's having to contend with. And also, not only that, the terrain makes command and control very hard for a division commander here. And what we're really going to see is almost 3 separate fights taking place moving forward.
Right. And from the federal perspective, Greene's brigade was still sort of in that halfway point where they were kind of getting ready to follow the other 2 brigades when skirmishers sent word that the Confederates were advancing towards Rock Creek. So now you see the Confederate skirmishers coming in and the line of infantry behind them, and Greene is going to have to set up a defense.
And I think it's a good point to think about that, Greene is going to reinforce the skirmish line here. He's also going to begin to align his brigade to cover this now extended front. So we're thinking of, basically almost to the top of Upper Culp's Hill, all the way over to Lower Culp's Hill. At points, it's going to be a single line that he's going to have. This is stretched thin. He's got his troops in position as best he can, but keep in mind now, when Greene's line ends, all of the federal works from that point to Spangler Spring are now completely empty. So Greene's men are going to kind of be it right now as these Confederates are moving forward. If we would look at this, we'd look at even the numbers of the Confederates against Greene, you'd think, man, this is not going to end well for George Greene. But as we're going to see, Greene is a savvy commander. He's an experienced commander. He also has the advantages of the high ground. He also has field works in front of him.
Yeah, and Eric mentioned numbers. I think what's interesting about that, too, we've talked about the shifting, fluid kind of numbers as guys are getting attached and moving elsewhere. We're now down to Johnson's 3 brigades having about 4,600 men. Greene's got about 1,300 men. So that old Civil War cliche that you want to have 3-to-1 odds to hit a fortified position, we're right at about 3-to-1 odds right now, but it's not decidedly in anyone's favor. So really, this is kind of a toss-up here. I can't wait to see how this ends because this could kind of go in anybody's favor here. The Confederates got the numbers, the Yankees got the defense and the breastwork.
So at this point, we're going to pause the action and do a little bit of a deep dive into George Sears Greene, Pap Greene, a very beloved officer, I think, among Gettysburg fans, and a guy that people said, hey, we'd like some more background on him. Tell us about Pap Greene. So we're going to spend a few moments giving you a little bit of background on, I think, one of the more popular officers here at Gettysburg.
Yeah, let's meet George Greene. So George Sears Greene was born on May 6th, 1801 in Rhode Island, which would make him 62 years old at the Battle of Gettysburg. Thus, as many of us probably know, Greene is the oldest field commander in the Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg. Now, his family had illustrious roots in the founding of Rhode Island and this great nation, including General Nathaniel Greene, who is said to be George Greene's second cousin. The father was in shipping, but he went broke during the War of 1812, which deprived George of a good private education. So he started working in a dry goods store in New York City when he received a recommendation and an appointment for West Point. Now, George Greene entered the academy in 1819. He graduated in 1823, 6 years ahead of Robert E. Lee, and was second in his class with several notable classmates, including Dennis Hart Mahan, Albert Sidney Johnston, and Hannibal Day, who ultimately Greene's daughter married Day's son. So maybe a lot of people don't realize there's a connection by marriage of those two. Eric, you want to pick up the story? What does Greene do after he graduates from West Point?
Greene is going to be assigned, because of his class position, to the engineers. But Greene decides on the artillery at first, and he's going to be commissioned a second lieutenant in the 3rd United States Artillery Regiment. However, due to his excellent academic performance, he stays stays at West Point until 1827 as an assistant professor of mathematics and as a principal assistant professor of engineering. One of the students that he is going to teach during this period is a young cadet from the Commonwealth of Virginia named Robert E. Lee. So kind of neat little connection there. In the summer of 1828, Greene is going to marry Mary Vinton, the sister of his best friend at West Point, David Vinton. Elizabeth, as she was known, gave birth to 3 children over the next 4 years, and while Greene was assigned to Fort Sullivan in Eastport, Maine in 1833, tragedy is going to strike the Greene family. Elizabeth and all 3 of their children are going to die within 7 months. Some have speculated this is tuberculosis or some other type of disease, but now think about what Greene is dealing with at this point. The loss of his entire family in 7 months.
You know, and it's interesting because I was thinking of this doing the research for the episode. You think about how many of our Civil War heroes have this kind of story in the background. You know, we talked about Louis Armistead when we did the Armistead episode. Just so many of these guys lost spouses, lost kids, you know, kind of working in the pre-war army. And it's really, you know, really a sad story when you think about what all of these guys were dealing with in their backgrounds.
I think it speaks a lot to 19th century life. You get an outbreak that, you know, unfortunately today we can relate to this with our current situation, but you know, at least we have modern medicine. They don't. So the idea of tuberculosis wiping out a family is a story that, as horrific and tragic as it is, was not one that was uncommon.
Yep.
Now, some would say at this point, Greene trying to ease the pain on his mind, maybe to get out of sort of the loneliness that comes with just being in the peacetime army. Even if you had a family, a lot of these guys talk about how lonely it was being in the peacetime army at some of these postings. He's going to begin to study both law and medicine, and by some accounts says that he comes close to receiving professional certification in both by the time he resigns his commission in 1836 to become a civil engineer. Think about how hard it is to become a lawyer, how hard it is to become a doctor, how hard it is to become an engineer. And Greene almost does all 3. So it speaks to the guy's mind and his ability.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, he leaves the Army in 35 to pursue civil engineering. He's going to build railroads in 6 states. He's going to design municipal sewage and water systems for a lot of big cities. You know, this is obviously a busy, accomplished guy. And, you know, he's going to remarry. He's going to remarry Martha Barrett Dana, the daughter of Samuel Dana, who was a prominent Massachusetts politician in 1837. They're going to have 6 children together, including 4 sons, 3 of whom are going to later serve with distinction in the U.S. military. Their oldest son, Lieutenant Samuel Dana Greene, is going to be the executive officer on the ironclad ship USS Monitor during the Battle of Hampton Roads. Another son, Francis V. Greene, is going to command a brigade at the Battle of Manila during the Spanish-American War. And a third son, Charles Thurston Greene, is going to be a lieutenant on his father's staff at Culp's Hill. Now, later in 1863, Charles is going to be wounded by an artillery shell and have his leg amputated. The one son who does not serve, George Sears Greene Jr., volunteered to do so, but was not allowed by his father because the father wanted somebody to survive and carry on the family name. But man, this is a distinguished family that goes above and beyond the call, in my opinion, to serve their country. And it was said that the father, George Greene, was a firm believer in restoring the Union when the Civil War broke out.
Now, when the Civil War does break out, Greene is over 60 years old. He's been out of the Army for almost 25 years. And as Jim said, he is a fervent believer in the Union. Some would say, though, he is not an abolitionist and was basically apolitical, but he believes strongly in this sense of the Union. And I have to wonder how much of that is not his sense of duty, but think about his family connections. These are the founders of Rhode Island. He's related to Nathaniel Greene, one of the great heroes of the War of Independence. So I was thinking, you know, my family spent all this time creating this union. I'll be damned if I let somebody tear it up. Greene also is still feeling pretty good, and he's going to be appointed the colonel of the 60th New York Volunteer Infantry in January of 1862. The 60th New York, where are we going to hear from them later on Culp's Hill? In April of 1862, Greene is going to be appointed a brigadier general of volunteers and is going to serve on the staff of Major General Nathaniel Banks in the Shenandoah Valley campaign against Stonewall Jackson. So some of these troops that he's tangling with on Culp's Hill, he will have tangled with before on other battlefields. At age 61, by this point, Greene is one of the oldest generals in the Union Army, and his troops look at him and call him, old man Pap Greene. In fact, he looks like the grandfather to many of these men. In fact, he could be, based on his age. Despite his age, though, he is an incredibly aggressive commander. He's going to command a brigade at Cedar Mountain with distinction, and it's at Cedar Mountain that his division commander, John Geary, receives a severe wound during the action, and Greene temporarily takes command of the division. Greene was again temporarily elevated to command of a division, now part of the Union 12th Corps of the Army of the Potomac at the Battle of Antietam. During the fighting at Antietam, the 12th Corps commander, Joseph Mansfield, the former classmate of George Greene, is going to be killed shortly after fighting begins. Greene is then going to take over and lead a crushing attack against the Confederates that pushes almost to Dunkard Church, one of the furthest penetrations in Jackson's line on September 17th.
Yeah, and a couple points I want to point out there, and I'm glad you mentioned them. Because again, we tend to view these Civil War officers strictly through their Gettysburg experience. And so naturally it becomes cliche to say, oh, Greene, the old engineer, the defensive specialist building his breastworks, defending Culp's Hill. Again, this was a guy who was aggressive and also had experience on the offense in the Civil War. So he is more than just a defensive specialist, as we know him here at Gettysburg. The other thing too, though, that I think is noteworthy to just kind of highlight there, again, we know him as the brigade commander at Gettysburg. This was a guy, as you said, who had division experience. Even though it was temporary, he had division experience on a couple of fields prior to Gettysburg. So he's more than just, an old man defending a brigade in breastworks at Gettysburg. In fact, he takes leave after Antietam. When he returned, there was a new division commander, Brigadier General John Geary. And Greene was disgruntled that Geary, with only a few days seniority over him, was assigned to the division. Now, Geary had been wounded at Cedar Mountain. His combat record was not as good, but I had some political connections and maybe just a general sentiment that, he was kind of owed a command when he came back. So that's another thing, too, when we go back to that controversy about the breastworks. You have Geary, Greene kind of talking about, are we going to build breastworks? Well, you're damn right I'm going to build breastworks. There's probably a little bit of heat between Geary and Greene.
And you would think with Greene's record, he would have been a natural fit for a division command somewhere. I've often wondered how much of that leave of absence after Antietam might have hurt. If he's 36 years old and does this, nobody really minds. But when you're in your 60s, people go, hey, the old man can't handle it. He's just not up to this. I think sometimes maybe the timing does not serve him well. I will point out, though, that his experience as a division commander, I think, is going to serve him well on Culp's Hill, because one of the things a division commander has to do is coordinate a number of different commands. What does Greene essentially facilitate on Culp's Hill on the night of July 2nd? A number of different commands. I think he handles that very well, and at times almost acts as a division commander on Culp's Hill. So I think we think of him in the brigade sense, but I really view his actions as more of sort of a ad hoc division commander on Culp's Hill.
Yeah.
Greene's going to resume command of his brigade. He's going to be involved in some skirmishes in northern Virginia. But at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863, his brigade is going to play a pretty important role. Greene's brigade was subjected to heavy artillery fire and then infantry assaults. He ordered his men to fortify their positions using trenches and other field works, and they were able to hold out against several Confederate assaults, suffering over 500 casualties out of the 2,000 men approximately engaged. Once again, during this part of the Battle of Chancellorsville, Greene is going to assume temporary division command as Geary is once again wounded. So it's kind of the story plays out again. Geary gets wounded, who takes over? Greene. And so you have to think, once again, here he is performing well in essentially brigade and division command.
All right, so it probably bears repeating at this point that Greene now has a line stretching at least a quarter of a mile, possibly more, from the top of Culp's Hill down through the saddle, and then even at this point, the 137th New York, which is now Greene's right flank, they've actually moved beyond the saddle and are now up onto the lower hill, which has been vacated by the rest of the 12th Corps and had previously been part of Kane's line. So Greene is really spread out, even though he's got the breastworks and everything protecting him. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move Greene's line up the hill, and then we're going to talk about the Confederate attack hits it. So we said the 137th New York is the right flank. Going uphill now, you've got the 149th New York, the 102nd New York, the 60th New York, and then the 60th New York in Greene's command is going to kind of connect with the 7th Indiana that we talked about earlier. In addition to that, you guys got to remember, Greene has got skirmishers out in and around Rock Creek. And when you read a lot of the accounts of this nighttime fighting, both on the Union and the Confederate side, what you really see is a lot of talking about the skirmishers. And the Confederates talk about, they started to drive in the Union skirmishers away from Rock Creek, and that's where the combat starts to pick up. So on the Confederate side, Eric, you're going to take over with, I think, Jones's brigade, which is going to hit the top of Culp's Hill first.
Yeah, I think it's important that we follow the progression of this Confederate attack, and keep in mind, if you view this at sort of the macro level, you would say this is Johnson's division attacking Greene. But to me, it's really 3 separate assaults against Greene. And if we look at this numbers game, if every brigade that Johnson has at this point, the 3 brigades attacked at once, Greene would have had a tough time handling that. But if you're having to face them piecemeal, this just further adds to the advantage that Greene has. So once again, if we look at the numbers, at times it's more of an even matchup for Greene's men at points in this fight. So the first Confederate unit to begin to move towards Greene's line is the Virginia Brigade of John Jones. They have the most difficult terrain to have to cross. This is the steepest part of Culp's Hill. So as they're moving up through the woods and the rocky slope, they're initially shocked at the strength of the Union breastworks in their front. Their charges are actually stopped with relative ease by the 60th New York, which is going to suffer relatively few casualties up there. Of course, the Confederate casualties are pretty high, including Brigadier General Jones himself, who's going to be severely wounded in the thigh and leaves the field. One of the New York officers is going to write that without breastworks, our line would have been swept away in an instant by the hailstorm of bullets and the flood of men. Of course, they're not facing a flood of men. Now, one of my favorite human interest stories of the battle actually comes to this point. Captain Jesse Jones of the 60th New York, Company I, is wearing a kind of special piece of equipment at this battle. At some point after the Battle of Chancellorsville, he acquires a metal breastplate, basically a bulletproof vest that some soldiers had. Supposedly he picked it up from somebody in the 11th Corps, but we don't really know for sure, but he's wearing this. He's going to give it a shot and see. During one of the attacks by Jones's men, Union Jones, Jesse Jones, is going to be struck in that breastplate. Now, where it hits is where the 2 pieces of metal come together, so it's going to be a thicker piece of metal there. It dents it. He's going to have probably a severe bruise, but it doesn't penetrate the breastplate, saving his life. Now, think about it. It goes an inch or 2 over, one way or the other. Could have been killed up there, but he's not. So kind of one of those neat little human interest stories, basically Civil War body armor.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that, because when we did the Peach Orchard book, and I forget the guy's name, but there was an artillerist out along the Wheatfield Road who was also wearing body armor. And I remember at the time kind of getting questions like, hey, is that unusual? Like, was he the only guy at Gettysburg who wore body armor? And I think there's probably other examples of that too, but it's a cool one up here on Culp's Hill.
Yeah, and if you ever want to get a sense of where Jesse Jones was, walk down from the 60th New York's monument, go to the forward advance marker of Company I, a really cool little marker, really cool part of the field, and you can see really the dominating position these men had, and really the rough terrain that Jones's Virginians had to traverse trying to get up there in the first place.
Yeah, and remember, not only is it a rough patch of ground, but it's getting dark, and there's, accounts where guys are saying, quote, men fired at what they heard, not at what they could see. So you can imagine it's just, the flashes of the muzzles in the darkness. Now, I mentioned the skirmishers before, and I just want to come back to that because, again, that seems to be kind of a common theme. A guy in the 60th New York wrote that, quote, not a shot was fired until they got within about 15 rods of us. Then the order was given to fire, and we did fire and kept firing. If ever the men loaded and fired more rapidly than the 60th did on that occasion, I never saw them do it. The rebels yelled like wild Indians and charged upon us in a double quick.
So by all accounts, Jones's men are going to make several assaults trying to dislodge this section of Greene's line. They are going to be unsuccessful. Soon as these attacks begin to sort of lose momentum, we now have Jesse Williams's Louisiana Brigade now entering the field, and they face a similar experience to John Jones's Virginians. They're having a hard time getting a sense where lines are. It's dark, the smoke's covering the field, and once again, they're facing impressive defensive works in their front. Now, rather than hitting the 60th New York, their attack falls primarily along the line of the 78th and 102nd New York. Once again, these guys are going to suffer relatively few casualties in a fight that, by some accounts, lasts about 4 hours. So this shows the beating they're putting on the Confederates, but really the lack of casualties they're seeing for themselves. I think what we're going to see is really outside of the 137th New York, Greene's men don't really suffer incredibly heavy casualties.
Yeah, and think too is how the terrain is changing now as we move our way downhill. So while Jones's brigade had a really steep climb, the hill is getting a little more gradual as we kind of work downhill and Williams' guys are attacking. There isn't as much, I don't think, written on the Confederate side about this attack as you see elsewhere. Again, maybe it's, in part Colonel Williams is only a temporary guy. The way he described it in his report is Williams said that his brigade engaged the enemy near the hill, and having quickly driven the front line into the entrenchments on the crest, we continued forward until we reached a line about 100 yards from the enemy's works. So if you take that at face value, they're getting about 100 yards away. When it again engaged him, the enemy, with an almost incessant fire for many hours, pending which several attempts to carry the works by assault, but being entirely unsupported on the right. So here you go again now, that common sort of Civil War thing. Hey, I could have done this had I not been supported better on the right, which would have been Jones's brigade. Had we been better supported on the right, we would have received more success. So again, you got kind of this notion, as you said, brigades are detached. They're kind of doing their own thing. Jones has got his own attack going on. Williams has got his own attack going on. Now, one captain said they charged the breastworks 3 times and were repulsed, but claimed that on the 4th attempt, they succeeded in gaining the works. Quote, I was shot in the leg and bayoneted in the left breast. I don't know how I got out of the breastworks, but the next morning I was in the woods with a number of other wounded men, and among the captured is going to be the color bearer of the 14th Louisiana. So again, hard times for Williams' brigade as they're trying to hit the center of Greene's line here.
And what I find kind of interesting, whenever we talk about the ORs and the who supports who, never does the person complaining about lack of support ever consider the situation that their support is under. I mean, it's not like Jones's Virginians are just kind of hanging out, doing nothing.
Right.
They're taking it on the chin. I think what we see is Jones probably would have felt he wasn't really well supported. Williams is saying, I'm not supported. And what is Maryland Stewart going to say?
Yeah,
I wasn't supported. So this really lends itself to this idea of 3 separate attacks rather than this one overwhelming Confederate wave moving up towards Greene's line.
Yeah, and I'll point out too in kind of this question of Jones versus Nichols, both of them are really suffering about the same casualties. Nichols's brigade is 35% casualties, 389 losses out of 1,100 men. Williams is at 35%. Jones is at 31%, 450 casualties out of 1,400 men engaged. So yeah, just to be clear, nobody's putzing around here. This is a very difficult assignment the Confederates have, and I think we should give them as much credit for even making as much headway as they do. Well, and remember, we've talked about it too. We know Greene has only got 1,300 guys up there. And again, we haven't really talked about reinforcements yet from the other part of the hill. But is the growing darkness, the Confederates don't know that. And I think what you do see in the Confederate accounts as well is some level of increasing caution as it gets darker and they get closer to the summit of the hill. They don't really know what is in front of them. So I also think, too, there's not quite the pell-mell, everybody in charge that you might get if there were more daylight on the field. And as we'll see at the end of the story, that's going to ultimately impact Johnson's decisions as well.
So as we now have Jones and Williams being engaged, let's now move to Maryland Stewart's brigade. So Stewart's men are going to begin to advance towards the area that was once occupied by Kane's brigade. As they do so, they're going to begin to come under a heavy crossfire from not only the 137th New York, but the 149th New York. Yep. Once again, what do we talk about in part 1 of this is the interlocking fields of fire, which is now what Stewart's men are facing. facing. This is a tough situation for them at this moment.
And the other thing, too, is, we're talking about the brigades kind of getting separated. Remember now, Stuart's own regiments within his brigade are starting to get separated, because the left of Stuart's line has more ground to cover. The right wing of Stuart's brigade basically crosses Rock Creek considerably in advance of the center and the left. So now you even got kind of Stuart's regiments kind of coming apart, and you've got his left now is going to kind of have to do a right wheel to come up around what is at this point more or less an unoccupied lower hill.
So as we see Stuart's men now sort of moving out of the works at this point, they're going to begin to move through the lower hill, making their way towards what we know as Greene's right flank. But at this point, they don't fully know, is this the flank, what we're dealing with? They're just seeing muzzle flashes in a very confused situation. The Union defenders, it was said, waited nervously, watching as the flashes of the Confederate rifles drew near. But as they approached, Greene's men delivered a withering fire. One soldier in the 3rd North Carolina noted that his regiment reeled and staggered like a drunken man. So talk about just that almost shock and hit that these men are going to take at this point.
So as Stuart's left is now coming up to the lower summit of Culp's Hill, and again, Stuart's left regiments are starting to move into unoccupied positions. This puts the 137th New York, Greene's right flank, in a really tough spot. So initially, the 137th New York, remember we said before, they had stretched out and they were actually on a little bit of the lower summit. The 137th New York now actually pulls back through the saddle towards their former position and is going to refuse their flank in and around the traverse. Ireland says in his report that we fell back to the line of works constructed by the 3rd Brigade. At this time, we were being fired on heavily from 3 sides, from the front of the works, from the right, and from a stone wall in our rear. Here we lost severely in killed and wounded. So Eric, the commander of the 137th New York, man by the name of David Ireland, often been referred to as the Joshua Chamberlain of Culp's Hill. The 137th New York often referred to as the 20th Maine of Culp's Hill. People often wonder, and I'm sure we got listener questions about this, why does Colonel Ireland not get the attention that Joshua Chamberlain gets? Why was David Ireland not in the movie Gettysburg? And all that sort of thing. Let's learn a little bit more about Colonel David Ireland, truly one of the unsung heroes of not only Culp's Hill, but the Battle of Gettysburg.
I think one of the challenges as to why Ireland is not as well remembered is Ireland does not survive the war.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have his ability to come back to the battlefield and remember what he did or his great memoir that he could have written. So I often say, people say history's written by the victors. I argue it's written by those that survive.
Yeah, it's written by the survivors.
If you survive, you get to tell your story. If you die, you don't.
Yeah.
And I think certainly you will see the men of the 137th New York having a lot of respect and reverence for their colonel, but it's a lot different when you're having others tell your story than you're telling your story yourself.
Yeah, and so just a little bit on Ireland. He was born in 1832. Ireland was born in Scotland, and his family emigrated to New York in the 1840s. He apprenticed to his father, who was a tailor in New York City. Now, in the 1850s, Ireland joined a regiment of militia, the 79th Cameron Highlanders, that was officially recognized by New York State in June of 1859. He was named the adjutant, and that unit ultimately became the 79th New York Volunteers. Now, we're not going to go into a full-blown Ireland biography here. I think the point we're just trying to make is, this is a guy with good experience. He was lieutenant and adjutant of the 79th New York. He fought with the regiment in the First Battle of Bull Run in September of 61. He's leading his regiment near Falls Church, Virginia. He's transferred to Newport Barracks for a while to train new regiments for Sherman's Department of the Ohio.
The other Newport Barracks. That's Newport Barracks, Kentucky.
I paused awkwardly there because I was waiting for Eric to say something. But Ireland does a lot of recruiting duty. Binghamton, it's a part of New York State that I'm familiar with. He was the mustering officer for new regiments training in Binghamton in the summer of 1862 and recruiting for a new regiment that was ultimately designated the 137th New York Infantry. Ireland was appointed colonel of the regiment regiment by the governor, who cited his military experience and ability. We know him to be a kind and gentlemanly officer and a brave soldier. Now, the 137th's real baptism of fire was at Chancellorsville. That's their real first major battle. Of course, we're talking about what they do here at Gettysburg, but I just kind of want to get into a point that Eric mentioned previously, because I think it's important in understanding the David Ireland story. When the 12th Corps goes out west in the fall of 1863 and beyond, Ireland and the 137th New York will go with them. So I think there's also a little bit of this, they're not part of the great closing phases of the war in the Eastern Theater. Although they're serving with heavy distinction out west, they're not part of Appomattox and all of that stuff. But most importantly, in September of 1864, while leading at that point at a brigade level, so Ireland is commanding a brigade in the Atlanta campaign, September of 64, David Ireland fell ill with dysentery and died. He was sent home and buried in Binghamton, New York, where he is today. So I think there's a lot of factors there on why he is not remembered as reverently as Joshua Chamberlain. But yeah, at the end of the day, he didn't live to tell his story, and that's the simplest answer for it.
And this might draw some heat, but I would say that Ireland actually has a more impressive resume than maybe Joshua Chamberlain, taking nothing away from Chamberlain. But I think this is a very capable, talented officer that doesn't survive the war, so we don't really know that much about him.
Yeah, and I think the problem is I get frustrated when I hear people trying to criticize Chamberlain with Ireland comparisons. Folks, this is a big battlefield. There is glory enough for all in the Union victory here at Gettysburg. You don't have to take away from one guy to talk about the other. Chamberlain and Strong Vincent did a heck of a job on the Union left, and doggone it, David Ireland and George Greene do a heck of a job on the Union right. And can't we all just get along with that idea?
Well, and as we've talked about before, there's kind of a tendency to knock certain figures. And in no means was I sort of bashing Chamberlain. But I think just to say that, if we look at the heroes we have of this battle, we look at their resume and we see some others kind of get forgotten. We go, man, that's a heck of a resume that guy's got. And I think, that's just part of the story. Look, if they don't do what they do on Culp's Hill, maybe it doesn't matter what happens on Little Round Top. If they don't do what they do on Little Round Top, maybe it doesn't matter what they do on Culp's Hill. It's a team victory.
It's a team effort.
There's no one moment that wins the battle. It's a lot of individuals making the right calls at the right time that leads to the Union victory at Gettysburg.